Hello and welcome to a special edition of The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing some of the very best interviews and reports from the past year of coverage on Monocle Radio, with highlights from our studios here in Midori House and from around the world. This week, in part 1 of our Best of 2025 shows, we'll look back at some of the big names we met in the past year, including Sir Sadiq Khan.
There are 272 tube stations, and they've been built over the last 160 years. And there's a very good reason why those in well-to-do areas have got great tube stations, right? And the property prices have been through the roof for decades. There are some parts of London which haven't got tube stations, and the property prices are less expensive. And so transport does unlock housing, but also improves quality of life.
From a Sir to a Lord, as we sat down with Lord Norman Foster.
Everything is designed. It's very easy to think that things happen by accident. It doesn't mean if there's a designer is not involved. Somebody's making a decision. We live in a man-made world.
All that and much, much more in the next hour here on a special edition of The Curator with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We begin this week's show with a look back to October, when Andrew Mueller sat down with the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, for an episode of The Foreign Desk. The United Nations was formally created 80 years ago, as its charter, drafted during the closing months of World War II, came into force. John Bolton, veteran American diplomat, former national security advisor, and from 2005 to 2006, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, joined the Foreign Desk to weigh whether the UN is still a relevant institution. Andrew Mueller began by asking him why he took the job.
Well, I thought and have believed for a long time that the UN needed substantial reform. And for various reasons, earlier jobs I had had in the federal government, study that I did after I got out when I was in a think tank, really gave me a pretty deep background about what was going on at the UN. So it wasn't just another federal government job. It was something I was, I think, really prepared for, and I thought it would be important to take on.
Did anything about the time you spent there do anything to change your assessment that you could lose the top 10 floors of the building and it wouldn't make any difference?
Well, unfortunately, no. I mean, it's government bureaucracies are kind of inherently inefficient, and a bureaucracy made up of government bureaucracies, which is what the UN Secretariat is, takes all those deficiencies and puts them together. And I think, of course, a lot of responsibility lies with the member governments. They want certain things out of the UN and they try and get them, but they don't want their opponents to get things out of the UN. So there's no final decision on anything. Everything is chewed over again and again and again. And I think that's yet another cause of ineffectiveness.
But is that inevitable given the nature of the organization as you describe it? I mean, it seems self-evident that with the best will in the world, if you assemble 193 bureaucracies in one place, you're going to get, well, a very big bureaucracy.
Right. Well, it depends on how you decide what the goals are and how you do the work. There are some parts of the UN system in many of the specialized agencies that have precise technical mandates, work they have to do. The International Telecommunications Union, the World Intellectual Property Organization. Those, as long as they stay away from politics, actually fulfill their mandates pretty well. What the big problem at the UN is the major political institutions, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, which are nearly totally ineffective.
I want to come back to a few of those points, but just picking up on your point there about how some of the very specific focused agencies and operations of the UN are useful. I know, to pick one example, you worked very hard to beef up UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which in theory was the one that bolstered UNIFIL's mandate, the peacekeeping operation in Lebanon, to disarm Hezbollah. So you do still think that in instances like that, the UN does have a useful role it can or should play?
Well, that certainly the objective of 1701 was to restore the authority of the government of Lebanon over the territory of Lebanon and turn Hezbollah into a political party instead of a rogue militia group. But obviously we failed. I mean, that brings us to October 7, 2023, when Iran launched the Ring of Fire strategy against Israel, first with Hamas, but then with Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. So 1701, which took a lot of effort to get adopted, failed and failed pretty quickly after it came into force because the government of Lebanon, even with 1701 in back of it, was not as strong as Hezbollah was.
But is the failure of 1701 or other reasons for the failure of 1701 attached to those broader dysfunctions you were talking about, or was that just an example of a mission being given an impossible job?
Well, I think it reflected the inability of the Security Council to, after having adopted 1701, to make sure it was carried out. So it is a certain failure of the Secretariat, but really it's a failure of the Council. I mean, it pronounces itself and nobody pays attention to it, and then there are no consequences.
But is there anything that can or should be done about that? Because the inbuilt problem, of course, with reforming the Security Council or indeed reforming the General Assembly is that the Security Council or the General Assembly would need to agree to it.
Right. And in the case of the Security Council, the 5 permanent members have vetoes over amending the charter of the UN as well. And it would really take, I think, charter reform in many cases. I'm not sure that if you started over again, you would end up with anything better.
I mean, you wrote last year, and you may have been joking on at least one of these counts. You possibly weren't joking when you said that President Trump should insist that the next Secretary General should be American, but you did suggest that you might be available. In the, I think now especially unlikely event that President Trump would make that appointment, what would you actually do were you Secretary General?
Well, I think the most important thing is to understand that the best chance the UN has to have an effect is to pick its targets and have a limited scope. Part of the problem is the UN itself is a huge, sprawling organization. Some of that has to do with the multiplicity of specialized programs. But a lot of it for the main UN organization and the Secretariat is that it tries to be all things to all people. And each country gets a little piece of it, and then they fight to preserve that. That has to stop. I mean, if the central purpose, not the only purpose, but the central purpose of the UN and the Security Council especially is the preservation of international peace and security, that's what they should focus on, and not all the many, many other things that they've gotten into over the years, like strategic arms control. The nuclear powers are going to do that on their own. The UN isn't going to have a role in it. I don't know why there's even a UN office for that, since it never had any impact. That's just one example. But what I would do would be to radically downsize and focus the Secretariat and the Office of the Secretary General on those core issues of peace and security.
But isn't what you're expressing there, I guess, the irritation of a superpower such as the United States with having to deal with an organization which is, well, almost by definition comprised of less powerful countries?
Well, that's what I think the Security Council was designed for. Originally, it only had 11 members. It's been increased to 15 decades ago, and now the calls are to make it even bigger. And I'll just guarantee you, the bigger you make the Security Council, the less effective it will be.
Former U.S. Ambassador to the UN there, John Bolton, in conversation with Monocle's Andrew Muller. Stay in the political realm for our next highlight. Now, it may seem strange, but in the nearly 14 years of presenting The Urbanist from our studios in London, they had never had the chance to speak with their own city's mayor. But strangely enough, away from home in Cannes, for this year's MIPIM Real Estate Trade Show, their moment arrived. The London mayor, Sir Sadiq Khan, was there to mark the opportune moment he sees for his city, and to capitalize on a perceived momentum as central government and city leadership are aligned. Monocle's Andrew Tuck began by asking how he ensured that efforts to increase housing density didn't forget to design in good infrastructure, services, and public realm too.
It's really important to make homes that are homes, not units of housing for profit. And so the London plan sets out you had a good design, minimum space for rooms, space for amenity, green roofs, green walls, parks and so forth. And then you have local plans where the councils work towards plans for their community that needs to be in accordance with the London plan, but respects Camden is different to Havering. Havering is different to Croydon. Croydon is different to Wandsworth. Recognises the local dynamics. That is very different to a situation where councillors, and I say this in a respectful way, I was a councillor for 12 years who sat at the planning committee, often with very small majorities, being nervous because a petition's got 200 names in, which is against a plan, not being objected to because of planning reasons, but because people quite like there being no development there. And that's where I think we need to empower councils, the mayor, and national government to be more assertive when it comes to good plans being given the green light. Because I think we've got a responsibility to recognise the supply of homes meets the demand of people who need housing, because, that is a serious problem in certain parts of our country.
Would you do away with the green belt?
No, that's a stupid generalisation. I wouldn't do away with the green belt. What I would do is recognise that many of us have wrongly assumed all of the green belt is pristine. Parts of it, I'm afraid, aren't very pristine. And that's why we're having a green belt review to try and look at which parts can be built on. I'll give you an example. If there is a piece of green belt in an area where all the brownfield sites have been built on, and the green belt is not pristine, it's near to fantastic public transport, I think we should be looking at good quality, high density housing in those parts of our capital.
You talked about the transport corridors and how vital these are for unlocking land and inspiring other people to come forward and build new homes along these and in clusters around tube stations. What's the potential for those to be unrolled? So the extensions, for example.
Well, look at the history of our great city. There are 272 tube stations, and they've been built over the last 160 years. And there's a very good reason why I'm making a generalisation, but to make the point. But those in well-to-do areas have got great tube stations, right? And the property prices have been through the roof for decades. There are some parts of London which haven't got tube stations, and the property prices are less expensive. And so transport does unlock housing, but also improves quality of life. Two recent examples: the Elizabeth line, 40 stations, 10 of them in the central parts of London, others elsewhere. Those homes that were built there have really improved in quality. I remember speaking to Tony Pidgley years ago, lobbying me about when he ran Berkeley Homes before he passed, lobbying for an Elizabeth line station at Woolwich. Successfully, as I said yes to him and Nick Rainsford, the MP at the time. Look at what's happened to that development in and around Woolwich. Look at the Northern Line extension near to where I live, Nine Elms and Barris Power Station. That Barris Power Station retail, but also the leisure and housing was unlocked because of the Northern Line extension. We're now introducing new buses across London because you can do it quicker. But if we can, extend the DLR to Thamesmead, that is north of 40,000 new homes there. Good quality homes, a great public realm, a sense of community. If we can extend the Bakerloo line south along the Old Kent Road, tens of thousands of homes there. We're consulting now on a Baker Loop express bus service to try and give confidence to developers. The West London Orbital, you've got councils now working together to invest in feasibility studies to look at the West London Orbital. And I could go on. The thing is, look, great cities don't stand still. Great cities continue to move forward. Whether you're a city, whether you're a business, whether you're a football team, standing still means going backwards. And, as long as I'm there, we're not going to stand still.
Tell me about Oxford Street, because, again, one of these projects which has inspired and riled people in equal measure for years now.
Well, Oxford Street is a good example of a project that if at first you don't succeed, try again. Same with the Elizabeth line. The Elizabeth line, I remember in 2017-18, people advised me to throw in the towel. And I said no. The government, by the way, started High Speed 2 at the same time as Crossrail. We finished ours, by the way, and the government hasn't. Oxford Street, I've been down this road before. Look, Oxford Street, when I was growing up, was a vibrant, busy, hustling, fantastic street. I used to work there in retail, in Debenhams and Barrett's. I remember going shopping there, meeting my mates outside Topshop. My daughter's shopping there, but it's tired. You've got too many poor quality shops, too many American candy stops. Nothing against Americans or American candy, but against American candy stops of poor quality. Two boroughs borders that street, and I think if there was a development corporation, we could leverage in third-party investment, but also if you could pedestrianise that street, think about the opportunities for not just retail but leisure and culture. And so we're working with the council, working with residents, working with businesses, working with third parties to try and really regenerate that part of London. And those businesses, whether you're flagship stores or whether you're a store that wants to invest there, you deserve the very best public realm, and that's what we're going to do.
That was the London Mayor, Sir Sadiq Khan, in conversation with Monocle's editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, earlier this year. Time for a political hat-trick now, as our third highlight from 2025 is from this year's GlobeSac Forum held in June. The last few decades in the history of Georgia have resembled a trial run for what Russia has attempted and may yet attempt in Ukraine. First, the inflammation of domestic conflict followed by the implanting of puppet breakaway statelets. Second, full-scale military assault. Third, the capture of the state by pro-Moscow interests. In Georgia, this third stage has taken place against the resistance of large-scale street protest and resulted in a standoff between President Mikhail Saakashvili, installed by Georgia's pro-Russian parliament in December, and President Salome Zurabishvili, elected by Georgia's people in 2018. President Zurabishvili previously spoke to the Foreign Desk at the Munich Security Conference in February. At the GlobeSec Forum in June, Andrew Muller began by asking if much had changed in Georgia since then.
For the worse, yes. What we're seeing is practically every day new layers of repression, new laws that are taken, new measures, new arrests, everything that can be done to limit, restrict the freedom of expression, freedom of demonstration, or any individual freedoms. Everything practically is done. We're not very far from Belarus in some ways, but we are far enough because there is still a very active civil society and protest movement that is alive, and political opposition that is alive also, despite the fact that this last week 4 or 5 political leaders have been arrested, and probably we can expect more in the coming days. So it's an evolving situation, and one that is evolving towards the worst. The state capture of Georgia by Russia is going on.
Do you have any concerns now, though, that the rest of Europe has kind of resigned itself to the situation in Georgia? We saw Georgia's Prime Minister, Irakli Kobakidze, who is of the Georgian Dream party. He turned up at the European Political Community Summit in Tirana, which is not the EU, but nonetheless he appeared to be quite warmly spoken to by President Macron of France, Prime Minister Donald Tusk of Poland, among others. Are you concerned that the EU is starting to just sort of
first
accept
of all, I
it?
wouldn't say that the warmly, I think, is a bit excessive. We've just read Prime Minister Tusk's declarations on Georgia.
True enough.
And that's the policy that I think Poland is following.
I do just want to pick up on that quickly, because as you'll be aware, whenever the current government of Georgia is asked about the EU, they are still saying that they see this as an aspiration. The Prime Minister, Irakli Kobakidze, has said it. The Deputy Prime Minister, Levon Davutashvili, said he wants it by 2030. Are they serious about any of this, or are they just saying that because they know that's what they have to say?
They are not at all serious about that. It's very clear every decision that they have been taking in the past 2 or 3 years are going in the direction that is the direction inspired or required by Russia. But they still need to take into account some part of their own supporters and what we all knew about Georgia, which is that 80% and more of the population was in favor of the European integration, means that it's true also of their own supporters that are now supporting, for different reasons, the ruling party for personal interest or political interest, but they still want Europe. So they cannot completely neglect those people and tell them openly that they're taking them to where no Georgian wants to go, which is under the control and domination of Russia. But that is clearly where we're going. We are today a repressive regime that looks very much like Belarus or Russia.
You talked earlier about wanting to see more of a coherent policy towards Georgia from the EU. What would that actually involve? What would you like to hear them say?
What I would like does not matter as much as what I think European Union needs, which is to qualify what's happening in Georgia, because it's really a challenge to European Union. It's a challenge to us, and we clearly understand the extent of the challenge. But the European Union has to understand that it is confronted to a new hybrid strategy of Russia that is using not military intervention as in the case of Ukraine, but using manipulation of elections, propaganda, all kinds of technologies, and including to have ruling party that is more or less under its control. All of these elements can be applied tomorrow. If the test in Georgia appears to be valid, it can be applied tomorrow to any European countries. And in fact, we have seen attempts in Romania to do the same thing. We've seen attempts that failed in Moldova, but that's something that Russia is clearly putting to a test. The same way as in 2008, it tested military intervention in Georgia before testing it elsewhere. And if it's successful in Georgia, which was probably the country in the whole of the Soviet Union the most resistant to Soviet propaganda, to Soviet domination, then it can probably work in many other places. So it's really a challenge to the EU's foreign policy, to the enlargement policy, and to see that the EU has no other reaction but to here and there protest this law, this arrest, but it's very punctual. It's not the expression of a policy, that it's not acceptable. When I hear that the European Union has a new Black Sea strategy, what does it mean without Georgia? What does it mean if Georgia is another Russia? We control the shore, then on the other side there is Romania. It's no coincidence that Russia has been testing those countries that are around the Black Sea, because Russia too knows that the Black Sea security and strategy in the Black Sea is very important for the future.
Still to come on this special edition of The Curator, we meet the philosopher AC Grayling. Lord Norman Foster discusses how to design for the planet, and When Life Gives You Lemons, the renowned chef Ruthie Rogers turns them into a new book. Stay tuned.
Craft matters, in small ways, like how a coffee is brewed, and in not so small ways, like how your money is cared for, which is why for 160 years, UBS has elevated banking to a craft, tailoring unique strategies that combine human expertise with the latest technologies, all happening across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the heart of it all. UBS. Banking is our craft.
You are listening to a special edition of The Curator, our weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We turn now to our next big-name interview, and this one is from the summer. Philosopher and author AC Grayling is one of the foremost thinkers of our time. He is founder of and master at the New College of the Humanities and has written and edited more than 30 books. He sat down with Monocle's Georgina Godwin to talk religion, humanism, and more.
When you came to the UK as a teenager, was that a very big change for you?
Not really, no, because all my childhood I had, of course, lived mentally in three places. One was ancient Greece, the other was ancient Rome, and the third was England. Even though I had not set foot on the soil here, Enid Blyton and, The Wind in the Willows and Amazons and, it was my whole reading, my whole mental life. I knew the names of trees in England and didn't know the names of trees in Africa. I mean, that's how much of a bubble it was, really. And also, I knew by heart, really, the map of central London. So that on my very first day here, I happened to be walking along, I think it was in Park Lane, and I was stopped by a tourist wanting to know the way somewhere. And I directed him, and afterwards I thought, golly, why didn't he look at the map before he came?
There was a huge tragedy in your life when you were young, which really, I guess, must have gone on to influence you in lots of ways. Tell us about your sister and your mother.
Well, let me preface what I'm about to say with the fact that I'm very conscious that pretty well all of us in all families, have this kind of experience and we lose people who are very dear to us. And then, of course, there are people in places of strife and conflict around the world who have much, much more devastating experiences, losing whole families and communities and so on. So, I don't want to single this out as anything in itself, awful as it was, as anything in general terms special. But of course, for one as an individual, it tends to loom very, very large and have an effect. And what happened was that my sister who had been born in a mine hospital in Luanshire in 1942, right in the middle of the war. My mother was a very small woman, very terribly difficult labour because of the anxieties people had in those days about caesarean sections and so on. My sister was a forceps delivery, and it crushed her skull, and she had this motor spasticity as a result. So she had brain damage and wasn't able to control her limbs properly for most of her life, in fact. And then by some sort of terrible miracle, a technique for freezing irritant brain cells was developed by a team of neurologists at Newcastle General Hospital. And she had this operation, which pretty well cured her. It was a remarkable, miraculous thing, but in quite the wrong way, because having not had, being in all other respects normal, I mean, she wasn't, educationally subnormal, anything like that. She hadn't been able to have boyfriends in an ordinary social life, and so she went sort of mad. And for the next few years, things were very difficult in that respect, and indeed, being so sort of emotionally undercooked and what have you, she got into a relationship with a married man in Salisbury, in Rhodesia, in Harare, and he wouldn't leave his wife, and so she tried to commit suicide, and then there were all sorts of difficulties like this. And then she met somebody very, very much older than herself, and within weeks of meeting, they married and went off to live in Johannesburg. And within weeks of marrying, he reported her missing. And so there was a tremendous search for her and so on. And after several weeks, her body was found in a river, and she'd been stabbed to death. And because the knife that had been used was a kitchen knife from their home, he was arrested and put on trial for murder, but ultimately acquitted because the evidence was just circumstantial. Apart from the sort of horror of that having happened to her, my parents had to go and identify her body. And my mother was ill at the time. She had a heart problem. And this trauma of the whole situation and of identifying the body precipitated a heart attack, and she died also. So we lost both of them at the same time. For my father, it was really awful. So it's hard. It's so hard to talk about it. My father had actually lost his own mother just earlier that same year. Mind you, she was quite superannuated, so that wasn't unexpected. But then, of course, to lose his wife and his daughter in that way, it was a terrible blow to him. And I remember in subsequent years when I used to go and visit him, because he just, like a beached whale, he just stayed on in Africa, having been on the point of leaving and, going off into retirement. And I remember hearing him in his bedroom at night, sighing before he lay down to sleep. And I thought to myself, my God, what that burden must be like to bear, and those memories. And he was terribly courageous. But anyway, I mean, in the early months after all this happened, my brother and I spent a great deal of time mopping and propping him before we really got, around to thinking about how it affected us so much. But I did feel that in all the different ways, because any sort of tragedy that happens in a family affects individual members of it in a number of different ways, and there are a number of different aspects to it. And the thing that came out of it in one way for me was that the greatest harm, in a way, that was done to my father because of what he had to carry from then on. So,
I mean, with multiple tragedies like that, it must make one question the existence of any kind of God.
Oh, well, I was already an atheist, a very convinced one, so there was no succour to be had from the thought that we might all meet again in some kind of discotheque in the sky or anything like that. But having been rather a swot all my life, I had read the Bible and thought about it, and there was one line in it that always stuck with me. It did give me a little bit of encouragement at the time, and it is a line from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, in which he says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And that has been my motto.
The philosopher and author AC Grayling there, speaking to Georgina Godwin earlier this year. Next, to a highlight from Monocle's show dedicated to the world of fashion. Misen Harriman first rose to prominence during the anti-racism protest in the summer of 2020, when his photography documenting the marches on London streets were widely shared. Then, in September of the same year, he made history by becoming the first black man to shoot the cover of British Vogue. And in 2021, he was appointed Chair of Trustees of London's South Bank Centre, a position he continues to hold. It is a remarkable career given that he only began taking photographs in 2018, just as he turned 40. He joined Natalie Teodosi on Monocle on Fashion to share his story.
2020 happened to us all, and COVID and lockdown happened. George Floyd was killed, and I didn't know what to do. As a black man, I have seen many versions of George Floyd, of people that look like me being murdered. And, I had run out of tears. And I looked to my wife, and she said, "Look to your camera." And I took my camera to, I think Hyde Park was the first time I went out, and I didn't know then whether I'd be shooting one person or 5,000. And I started shooting the anti-racist movement. And I had very few followers on Instagram at the time. And about a month in, I opened my phone one day and my Instagram was going nuts. And all my friends were DMing me saying that the son of Martin Luther King had shared my image. And at that time, I didn't know him, and I don't think he knew who I was. I don't think he even knew that the image was not taken in America. And then all the celebutants, everyone you can think of, started sharing this image. And I guess Vogue came across my work. And it's just crazy when I think about it, because my first fully professional gig was shooting, and as you know in fashion, September for Vogue is not a small deal. And Edward Enningfield and the team took a huge risk by giving a then unknown photographer the cover and the gatefold. I don't know how many, I must have shot 13 people. And that was my first job, the September issue of British Vogue, which is kind of crazy. So
so it all happens so quickly.
Very fast, yeah.
But it also kind of shows the power of an image, and that it can still have that even at an age where we're really bombarded with imagery all the time. What is it that makes a powerful image for you, and what do you think that those pictures that you took in Hyde Park, why did they resonate with people so much that Martin Luther King's son reposted it, and then all these celebrities and Edward Enningfield and everyone, I think it was an emotional reaction in many ways,
I think
right?
Between the highlights and the shadows is truth. I do the opposite to traditional fashion photography. I don't Photoshop. I don't retouch. It's mainly in black and white, and it's truth. And people saw that, and I guess it reflected the time that we were living through in a way that you cannot help but react to. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Was it quite instinctive that you made this your signature, the black and white photography, no retouching, because things happen so quickly for you, and at first you were just experimenting on your own before you got these big jobs? Or
I've grown up obsessing over film and photography, and as Robert Frank said, the eye should learn to listen before it looks. So my eye, even though I didn't have the tool, was always listening. And when I had the tool, it was ready to really be a mirror to the human condition.
Tell me a little bit about, you were a big cinephile and knew a lot about photography. That was in you, the love of that. What were some of the artists and the creatives that over the years inspired you?
Gordon Parks obviously is a huge, Eve Arnold, Cecil Beaton, and, I think if you look at the 100 most iconic images ever taken, many of them, if not the majority, are in black and white. So I guess that inspired me. And then with fashion, Peter Lindbergh is the beginning of an end, I think, of how you should, his gaze on women particularly was so different. It wasn't the traditional male gaze. And hopefully I'm standing on all of their shoulders,
Yeah. And you really dabble between still and moving image, and you've had an enormous success with your short film as well. Mm-hmm. Is that part of the beauty of your work, that you can work in between the two mediums?
There's a fluidity in my sense of storytelling. I don't see that film and photography are separate. I treat them really the same. I'm looking to harness the emotion of who we are. And let's be honest, we're living through a time when everything feels historic. We're living through a time that I never thought I would live through. There are things that are happening today that are very similar to what I read about in my history classes. So to be able to bear witness to it, and I don't sell my work to newspapers, I'm not commissioned. So it's extra important for me to have this body of work that is a testament, a ledger, if you like, of who we are, for better or worse.
That was the celebrated photographer Misan Harriman speaking to Natalie Theodosi from Monocle on Fashion. From fashion to design now, as we celebrate some of the big-name interviews we've had on Monocle Radio this past year. And they don't get much bigger than this. This year's World Design Congress took place at the Barbican Centre in London, and the event's theme was simple but important. How do we design for the planet? At the Congress, we were lucky enough to sit down with Lord Norman Foster, the legendary British architect behind many icons of the built environment, including the Gherkin in London. Monocle's Carlota Rebelo spoke to Lord Foster about quality of life and human-centered design. And Carlota began by asking how the climate and sustainability conversation has changed over his career.
Well, we were promoting everything that is now called sustainable, green, in the late 1960s, early 70s. And at that time, it was a fringe activity. And now it's mainstream and everybody's talking about it. So we've been fairly consistent on that and, of course, moved with the technology. And the technology, we mustn't forget, is a means to improve the quality of our lives. Whether that's in a building, whether it's in a city, in urbanity, that is really the power of design. And we have the means to live a good life, to have a quality of life, and at the same time reduce our carbon footprint. We have the technology, we have the means.
One of the other points, when you decided to present two of the case studies of work you've done that you're quite proud of, unexpectedly, they weren't buildings. So I'm kind of going to ask you to retell that story. And we're talking here about the suspension bridge.
Yes, there was a journalist who was interviewing me and said, you've done so much in London. What are your favourites? What are the ones that you really rate or whatever? And I said, they're not buildings, because if I talk about the effect of design on the citizens of London and the visitors, then it's going to be Millennium Bridge and it's going to be Trafalgar Square, because those influence the quality of urban life to a far greater extent than any individual building, however powerful that building and important that building might be. And of course, if you take the number of people who cross from the North Bank to the South, which has equalized, so it's brought prosperity to the traditionally poorest South Bank from the rich financial centre of the financial square mile and Trafalgar Square. Most people have forgotten it was a horrendous pedestrian roundabout. You risked your life going there. The heart of London was largely occupied by pigeons and one or two people feeding them. And so the transformational effect of what we did there has been revolutionary. It's now become the living room of London, the heart of London for cultural events, concerts, celebrations, festivities, whatever. So it's perhaps a way of saying that something we take for granted, the infrastructure, the pedestrian spaces, those influence our quality of life, and we can make them better. So it's a plea for the infrastructure of connectivity, public spaces, and cities hold the key to climate change. That's not to say the buildings are not important. Of course they are. I'm an architect. It's my lifeblood.
Are you worried about the pace of urbanization?
The pace of urbanization, it's very difficult to perhaps comprehend that where we are right now. But those parts of the world which are rapidly urbanizing. I mean, the equivalent over the next 25 years is the construction of 11 cities the size of London every year for the next 25 years. So that's a daunting challenge. And what I was doing at this event was saying we have a choice. We can encourage those kinds of cities which have a low carbon footprint, which everybody wants to go to, as Monocle itself as a magazine selects cities. They're all a particular kind of city. They're pedestrian friendly, they're walkable, they have good public transport, they have neighborhoods, they have a historic core. They're not the car-borne sprawling cities, so they consume half the energy. They're more desirable, they're healthier, and they also conserve nature and biodiversity. It's a win-win.
When we talk about, indeed, quality of life in cities, it's all those factors. And almost also then there's this element of community supporting you and enabling that community. We know that one of the main issues that cities face nowadays is loneliness in cities.
Combating loneliness is a killer. It's also promoting exercise, which is health.
And that's where design can be powerful.
I mean, as ever, it's a constant. Everything is designed. It's very easy to think that things happen by accident. It doesn't mean if there's a designer is not involved. Somebody's making a decision. We live in a man-made world.
Your foundation sits in Spain, and that's just 2 hours away. And often we talk about how just a slight adjustment in perspective can boost creativity, can allow us to see things differently. And I'm curious if splitting your time between there and here has also had that effect on you, and of course on top of all the travels as well. But does a slight change in perspective help when it comes to finding inspiration?
Yes, the practice is based here in London, and there are certain things the practice can do. There are some things the practice can't do or it's difficult to do, and the foundation can do. And so the foundation has a global reach. I mean, the graduate class that I was illustrating in this talk comes from 23 countries, but they are separate in every sense, legally, financially, and so it's helpful to have a geographic difference. And Madrid, like London, is pedestrian friendly, it's compact, it's high density. You could argue that also it has, in its growth, it's sprawled as a car-borne model, not to its advantage. And London, notwithstanding the fact that the green belt, which constrains London, so London has not sprawled in a way that many other cities has done. That's a rather interesting difference between the two, because I think the politicians are not aware of that effect of the green belt. It's seen as a developer's opportunity to kind of dilute and divide, rather than a great invention. Interestingly, reinforced at the height of World War II, when the master plan for London, the Abercrombie plan, was drawn up in the height of the war. So as a real gesture of regeneration and optimism for a future.
The legendary British architect Lord Norman Foster there, speaking to Monocle's Carlota Rebelo for an episode of The Urbanist earlier this year. And finally on today's show, we end the special edition of The Curator by looking back at a guest I was lucky enough to meet here in the studio. The legendary chef Ruthie Rogers from the incredible The River Café published a new book this year titled Squeeze Me, Lemon Recipes and Art. It's a stunning celebration of lemons and was made in partnership with iconic artist Ed Ruscha. It's certainly not your usual cookbook. Here is Ruthie with more.
It's Ed Ruscha, who is, as we know, the great living artist of today, and also myself doing the recipes with the River Cafe, and also Johnny Ive, who designed the Apple Watch and the iMac with Steve Jobs many years ago, and has a company now called Love From, and Heather Ive, who's a poet. So I was doing a lot of the words. So it was a real collaboration of friends and people who, you know, have the same values, the same ideas. And with Ed, I've been a fan of Ed long before I knew him. His work, as we all know, is just a great artist, as I said. I always said to him, you know, he loves books. Books are a large part of, especially his early work, of the ones he did of the gas stations. And so I said to him, Ed, please, let's do a book. And he went, Ruthie, one day we'll do one. And then we'd go back to his dry martini or whatever he was doing. And so I said, well, how about it? A couple of years ago, how about that book? And he said, let me finish the show at the Museum of Modern Art. He did a great retrospective there. And I said, okay. And then after that, it was, I have another this retrospective is traveling to Los Angeles. So let's talk then. So we did. And I was in LA and I went to the studio. And he said, okay, I'll do it on two conditions. One is that it's a small book, a short book. And the other one is it has one subject, food-wise. And so we went into behind his studio. He had lemon trees. And so he came on the idea of doing a book about lemons.
And I think lemons are the best.
They are the best.
I know in your restaurant you use a lot of lemons.
We use a lot.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
But how interesting that he had lemon trees in his studio.
In a very, and in a very, it's not a garden. It's in Culver City. It's almost industrial in its aspect. He has cars in the garage. He has concrete on the floor, but then there's a small patch and it has lemon trees in them.
And of course, in the Beautiful, there's about 47, 48 lemon recipes. But it's fascinating that there's not a picture of the dish itself, but beautiful photography by Ed as well. It's quite innovative. It's not your usual recipe book, right, Ruthie?
Well, what we want people to do is to, explore it through reading the recipes. Oh, I didn't know you could make a risotto with lemon. As you just said to me,
roast potatoes.
5 minutes, you could do roast potatoes with lemons. And it's a book that explains itself through joy, I think. It portrays itself through happiness and intrigue. And Ed's work, he did all the art and photography in his studio. And the captions that he always has, well, not always, but a lot of his work has words. He plays with words. And so he has his own typeface, and he put the type on the photographs. And Heather Ive did the words. Some of them were Ed's that he found, W.C. Fields or Pablo Neruda. And then she did the rest, which are funny and intriguing. And you turn the book around to read them.
It's cheeky sometimes.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a bit cheeky. That's a good word. And we almost did the recipes like captions because we wanted them to be able to have a lot of white around. We wanted the art to shine. And we also, if you do a book with so few recipes, there's no point in having chapters because you might only have 4 pastas and, 3 drinks and 1 soup. So we did it the way we sort of felt the rhythm of the book was. So you might have, a whiskey sour followed by a risotto and a risotto followed by an ice cream. It's a book to look at in bed. It's a book to take into your kitchen. It's a book to leave, on your sofa. It's a great present. It's really, we've priced it very fairly so people could use it. And it's called Squeeze Me.
I love the title already.
That was Heather Ive, yeah.
And by the way, going back to lemons, I think they are so versatile and truly versatile because they can be sour, it can be sweet, it can be salty. I mean, there's so many different usages, right? I don't think there's many ingredients quite like that.
No, I'm already thinking about the next book, and we're thinking, well, what ingredient would be that you might do with that for, able to do this? And I think it also is very delightful because Ed really wanted the photographs at the end of a little girl just eating a lemon. And that's pretty radical to actually just put a lemon in your mouth. But there she is.
It's funny that, I grew up in Brazil, Ruthie, so for us, actually, because we're more of a lime country, but every time there were lemons in the supermarket, it was considered a little bit more upmarket. We called it the Sicilian lemon, so we had this kind of image of the lemon as there's quite an interesting connection there.
What did you make with them?
We used to make cakes, actually, a lot of desserts with it. Chicken as well, I think chicken with lemons. Do you have a favorite recipe from the book? Not a favorite, but one that perhaps come to your mind now, because all of them are your favorites.
They are, it's like having children.
Yes.
I think that I was explaining, but maybe we should do a different one, because I was explaining about the recipe that you add lemon to the milk and then it curdles the sauce, which is for pork, but you can do it with chicken. And it was something that my mother-in-law always used to do. She was a northern Italian. She would brown a chicken, say, and she would then put it in a saucepan and put with lemon peel and milk about halfway up and let it cook very, very slowly. And then what happens, it becomes curdled, but in a good way. You're always worried about milk curdling. And so I think that one is a special recipe because it's just two ingredients with work together to make something delicious. And then I love, I can say that, grilled sea bass with lemon, because if you squeeze a lemon over it, you don't need a rich sauce with it. You don't need very much. The lemon and the juice forms its own sauce. I love a lemon sorbet.
Granita as well.
Granita, yeah. And I love whiskey sour, which has lemon. So we have, as you say, it's like choosing your best friend or your best film or your best recipe. But I'm very proud. And these are, my name is on the cover because there were 3 people, in a way, that did it. It is a River Cafe cookbook. The recipes all come from the River Cafe kitchen.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by San Impi and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week for part 2 of our Best of 2025, as we hear some of the very best of the programs here on Monocle Radio from the past year. Thanks for listening.